Over the last couple of months, we've seen a lot of graphics cards being released, and some in the form of the 7900 GRE being marketed toward regions outside of China, and for a much more attractive price point of $549, which, after the launch of the 4070 Super, now means that the freshly cut 4070 non-Super matches it price for price. So the big question comes down to which one is the better performing, the RTX 4070 or the 7900 GRE? Well, that's what we're going to find out by testing them in 42 games and at 3 resolutions. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video's sponsor. Great, I've finished my filming. Now I just need to get this on here and I can start my edit. No, I'm out of space to store this footage. How am I going to edit this video if I can't get the footage on the PC? I can't delete anything. I need all of this for other projects. I'm doomed!
Conveniently timed delivery.
Ooh, my new NAS. Wait, how did you get in here? With the TBS H574TX NAS book from QNAP, my storage woes are finally over. Featuring the ability to add up to 5 M.2 NVMe drives, storage and speed is no longer a worry. With its slim and stylish design, it looks great anywhere, and you can take advantage of the lightning fast 10GBE capabilities or use Thunderbolt 4 to connect it directly to your system for an easy and convenient storage solution for all your files with no limitations. Click the link in the description to find out more. Now, as always with these head-to-head videos, I don't want to bore you with the specs, facts and figures of the cards, and for 2 reasons. The first is that we covered all of that in our day 1 launch day content on each of them. And secondly, because comparing core counts and the likes kind of across an AMD and NVIDIA GPU just doesn't make any sense, because they utilize different architectures and work completely differently. So there would be, I guess, no real basis of comparison. Instead, there's 2 things we need to focus on here, and the first one is price. The 7900 GRE used to be priced at the equivalent of $649 US, but with the release into the rest of the world, AMD purposely cut the price to $549 in the hope of bringing the fight to NVIDIA, especially as NVIDIA cut the price of the 4070 to the same $549, as the recently released 4070 Super came in at the $599 price tag that the non-Super used to have. So lots of chopping and changing, and you know what, I'm all for it, because more performance for less money is always good in my books. The other thing that is at the heart of it is performance, which straight away I believe AMD will likely win. But while that may seem pretty clear cut, it's not when you factor in the extra benefits of buying an NVIDIA card, such as the better streaming capabilities thanks to the NVENC encoder, the better editing capabilities due to CUDA acceleration, and in theory, better ray tracing performance. So I guess really a lot of that will come down to the individual and if they can make use of those features by sacrificing some performance. Today, however, is all about performance, so we won't focus on all of that, and instead we'll just look at how things do across 42 games. Now, one quick caveat is that while we're using the NVIDIA 4070 Founders Edition, for the 7900 GRE, we're using the Nitro Plus model from Sapphire. It is more expensive than $549, but as we've proven time and time again on the channel, that generally lends itself to better cooling performance and not to any extra gaming performance outside of margin of error. Now to test, we put the cards onto our GPU test bench consisting of an AMD Ryzen 7 7800X3D sitting in a Gigabyte B650E Aorus Master with 32GB of Corsair Vengeance RGB, 6000MHz CL30 dual channel memory. All testing was done on Windows 11 with the latest updates applied and with the latest BIOS revision for the motherboards that we used. We also used AMD and NVIDIA's latest drivers, and we tested 42 games in total, though we'll be looking at around 15 today before taking a look at the overall percentage differences. We will be showing 1080, 1440 and 4K results today, though I guess really our main focus is going to be on 1080 and 1440 due to the nature of these cards and I guess where they're aimed at in the market. Also, if you want to see the individual data for every single game, we will be putting the charts up over on our Patreon, so if you want to check them out too, the link for that is as always down below. So with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. So starting things off with a Plague Tale Requiem, where at 1080p the 7900 GRE is off to a good start with a 17% lead over the RTX 4070 from NVIDIA. And then as we move up to 1440p, that gap grows significantly, with AMD now pushing out 26% more performance over Team Green. Though both are still more than playable, which is more than what can be said at 4K, where both GPUs fall short, though that is expected. But even then, the 7900 GRE still manages to pump out 29% more frames overall, and with a higher 1% low than the average on the NVIDIA card. It's a similar story in Baldur's Gate 3 where AMD takes the win across all resolutions. At 1080p, the GRE has a lead of 22% over NVIDIA. Then at 1440p, it carries on with a strong lead of 21%. And both cards are still playable then at 4K, even on ultra settings. Though the GRE still commands a 23% lead, resulting in 75 FPS compared to NVIDIA's 61, which just hits that mark that most gamers crave. Things go from bad to worse for NVIDIA in Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, where at 1080p the GRE stretches its legs with a 44% lead over NVIDIA. But more interesting is 1440p, where AMD continues to hold a strong lead of 48%, but when comparing the AMD card's 1440p performance to that of the NVIDIA card's 1080p performance, there's not really much in it. And this is quite a big blow for Team Green. Again, 4K is still more than playable on both cards, but with 51% separating the two, the AMD card is definitely going to give you a better gameplay experience overall. As we move on to Cyberpunk at 1080, things draw closer, though due to the scene we use and limitations, even on our 7800X3D, we see both GPUs coming in evenly matched, though AMD do come in much stronger in the lows. Moving up to 1440p, the limitations are now gone and AMD continues its trend of taking the lead, and by a sizable margin of 32%. Then at 4K it sees an even higher difference, with AMD leading by a whopping 67%. But at such low frame rates, you're going to want to dial down your settings or implement some form of upscaling. As we enable ray tracing, NVIDIA's RTX 4070 wakes up as expected and fights back. At 1080p, the GRE now comes in 13% slower, though both are below 60 FPS, so dialing things back a bit would net some sizable gains on both cards. As we move up to 1440, NVIDIA still hold the lead, with AMD now coming in 14% slower, and both GPUs would lead to stutters in more intensive scenes anyway. Then at 4K, we're talking a single digit FPS difference, and both are frankly unplayable. So yeah, upscaling, dialing down the settings, something needs to give. As we move on to F1, the latest patch update has given some huge gains to Team Red, as they now lead by 46% at 1080p, though at such high frame rates on both cards, you're never going to notice the differences. And that can be said again at 1440p, where AMD lead the way by 31%, but again, very high numbers, so unnoticeable differences. 4K is arguably where you could notice the variance, and it's here where AMD take a full house, with again a 46% lead over NVIDIA's RTX 4070. In ray tracing, again due to the patch, AMD has some really strong performance across the board. At 1080p, the GRE manages to push out 21% more frames, and 1440p sees a similar 22% margin in favour to the latest GPU from the red team. 4K still has AMD winning by 18%, but we're now into the territory of unplayable frame rates on both cards. An upscaling or a settings change would see much healthier figures. Moving over to Far Cry 6, and AMD is still managing to make NVIDIA look pretty inferior. At 1080, they hold a margin of 20% over NVIDIA, and that only increases as we go up in resolution, as 1440 now sees a 26% margin, again in favour to AMD. Then at 4K, the results draw closer slightly, but we're still seeing 23% more performance from AMD, though both cards are still more than playable. When we enable ray tracing, NVIDIA fights back as the GRE now comes in 1% slower, though that could be argued as margin of error anyway. But what's more interesting is the much stronger low figures presented by the Radeon-based GPU. The win, if you can call it that, is short-lived at 1440p, as AMD now commands a 12% lead over the RTX 4070, and a slightly larger margin at 4K of 15%, with both cards presenting more than playable frame rates. In Hogwarts Legacy, the wins keep on coming for the GRE as it comes in with 24% more performance at 1080p, and holds a more impressive 31% lead at 1440p, which is where these cards are aimed at in the market. At 4K, the GRE and the 4070 both come in below 60 FPS, though again the AMD-based GPU still takes the win with 35% more performance overall. And as we've seen in other games, AMD holds much stronger 1% low figures on all resolutions. With ray tracing enabled, again NVIDIA put up a solid fight and now comes in the stronger of the two cards. At 1080p, this now puts AMD on the back foot by 11%, and a similar 10% at 1440p, while 4K sees the biggest variance, but this time NVIDIA now dropped 23% behind. Though without upscaling and on this preset, 1080p on the 4070 is the only result that gives performance above 60 FPS. Spider-Man is next up on the very high preset, and the results are much closer between the cards, though NVIDIA do manage to edge it at 1080p, but with a margin of error difference between them of just 1%, so you could classify that I guess as a draw. As we move up in resolutions, the cards shift about a bit, and now AMD take the win at 1440p and 4K by 4% and 9% respectively. While the 4K result is a solid win, the 1440p is bordering on levels of margin of error, and retesting could see the gap narrow slightly. Then, looking at ray tracing turned on, it's a very similar story. NVIDIA take the win at 1080p with AMD falling 6% behind, but the extra memory among other areas helped push AMD at the higher resolutions with a 2% margin of error win at 1440 and a slightly higher, but still arguably margin of error win of 4% at 4K. In Ratchet and Clank on the very high preset, AMD is back to winning in style with a 20% uplift in frames at 1080p, 16% margin at 1440p, and smaller yet still impressive considering the same price point, 9% win at 4K. And as we've seen in Ratchet and Clank time and time before, NVIDIA have a really niggly bug when it comes to a, pretty dire 1% low figure that just still seems to not be fixed. Enabling ray tracing does sort the 1% low figures somewhat, but AMD still holds the edge at 1080p with 9% more frames. 1440p sees the margin shrink to 4%, which is on the border of margin of error, but I'd still chalk that up as a point in the favour of AMD. While 4K doesn't really give us much to talk about at such low frame rates, but with support for upscaling, you could still play at 4K with a sacrifice in quality. Booting up our last game, Starfield, and again it's a slam dunk for AMD as it pushes ahead of the 4070 at every resolution. At 1080, the GRE comes out 7% ahead of the 4070, while 1440p improves on that ever so slightly, increasing the margin to 10%. And then at 4K, that margin widens once again, now seeing a 14% uplift in performance over Team Green's offering. So in all honesty, that was pretty painful. AMD have really managed to step up their game as of late at every resolution and in practically every game. Now, I went into this knowing that AMD would have some strong wins, especially in rasterization, but I never expected it to be by quite so high margins. Even when it comes to ray tracing, AMD have really managed to put the work in, and in all honesty, it's paying back in dividends based on the performance that we saw today. Now, to get a better overall idea, as mentioned, we did test both cards in 42 games in total, so it's worth taking a look at the breakdown of the percentage differences in each game. It's here where at 1080p it's a pretty clear-cut victory. The performance of the GRE outshines NVIDIA in all but 2 titles, and even then we're talking margin of error victories, so nothing of real contention, especially when you look at the big gains that AMD have in the likes of F123 at 46%, Call of Duty at 44%, and even Alan Wake 2, which is a title that NVIDIA collaborated on at 40%. Now the gains even after that are still pretty high, and this puts the GRE 19% faster overall, which for the same money is actually pretty impressive overall. As we move up to 1440, the GRE comes in even more powerful, now with a 24% lead over the 4070, with leads in, well, every single rasterization based title. The lowest comes by way of Spider-Man where it sits 4% faster, but the bigger results again come by the way of Call of Duty at 48% and F123 again at 46%. Even titles that are NVIDIA centric, again like Alan Wake 2 and Cyberpunk, see huge gains of 33% and 32% respectively, thanks to the raw power and extra VRAM that comes with the RDNA based GPU, which in turn makes the 4070 really look inferior for its price point. At 4K, things go from bad to worse for NVIDIA as the 7900 GRE comes in 27% faster overall, now with Cyberpunk taking the top spot at 67%. Followed not too far behind by again Call of Duty, F123 and Alan Wake 2. There are some games like Tiny Tina's Wonderland, Spider-Man Remastered and Ratchet and Clank that see much smaller differences of less than 10% that bring the overall averages down. But I guess overall it's pretty clear to see that NVIDIA have fallen short. As we look at ray tracing at 1080, it's a pretty clear-cut conclusion. NVIDIA do manage to fight back, but it's still not enough to fend off the GRE that now sits 2% faster overall. NVIDIA do make up some of their gains in Cyberpunk, Doom Eternal and Hogwarts, but the margin in F123 kind of negates those wins quite dramatically. There are obviously smaller gains for each card in the likes of Watch Dogs, Far Cry and Alan Wake 2, along with evenly matched performance in Warhammer Darktide. Then as we move up to 1440p, the margin increases in favour of AMD, now to 4%, again with the biggest lead coming by the way of F123 and the biggest loss by the way of Cyberpunk. There's 6 titles in total that fall within what could be classed as margin of error, but again, that's just a testament of how well AMD are catching up in terms of ray tracing performance overall, and showing that NVIDIA maybe have to do something more to, keep being competitive. Lastly, as we look at 4K, as expected, the extra VRAM comes into play on the GRE, and that helps to extend its lead to 11% over NVIDIA's 4070. This time we're seeing pretty sizable gains in the likes of Ratchet and Clank and Hogwarts Legacy, but there is a caveat. While the percentage differences look pretty large, the frame rates are much lower, so it does make the percentages look somewhat inflated. What I'm trying to say is a gap between smaller numbers works out to a higher percentage than a similar gap at higher numbers. So that's now confirmed that NVIDIA have fallen short here, and it was always going to be an odd one considering the 4070 and the 4070 Super are only separated by a $50 difference. So maybe we'll look at the 4070 Super versus the 7900 GRE in an upcoming video. Now, I went into this with an idea about performance and thought it would actually end up being closer than it was, especially with ray tracing performance. But AMD have really done some impressive things here, not just in rasterization, but across the board. Essentially, when you think about it, the GRE is an odd card, as it is essentially a cut down 7900 XT, a card that maybe didn't make the cut and instead was downgraded to be a GRE instead. Now, one area that NVIDIA potentially could win is with power and temperatures, which is typically where NVIDIA sometimes does a bit better. They generally hold better efficiency overall, but with the performance so different, I just feel maybe that's not going to be enough to make any huge arguments for going with Team Green on this one. In terms of the total board power, as expected, the RTX 4070 comes in using a lot less power, especially in the likes of Alan Wake 2 with ray tracing, where the 7900 GRE seemingly uses quite a lot more power, a whopping 96% more in fact, which is quite a big selling point for NVIDIA. Now, when we look at other games, the difference isn't as much, though we're still talking around 48% in A Plague Tale Requiem, 63% in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and 58% in Hogwarts Legacy. Now remember, this is total board power, so it's not just the GPU core, and being a Sapphire model of 7900 GRE, you'd expect it to use a bit more. But even if it was a lesser model, NVIDIA would still come in the better of the two, and by quite some margin. When it comes to temperatures, in some games, the cards are actually evenly matched when we look at the data from Ratchet and Clank and Remnant 2 for instance, with both GPUs sitting under 65 degrees. There were on occasion some small variances like in Starfield of just 1 degree and Baldur's Gate 3 with 2 degrees separating the cards, with the RTX 4070 actually coming in the hotter of the two. Though you could argue that the AMD card we use, being a Nitro Plus model from Sapphire, has superior cooling performance anyway when compared to a Founders Edition model. Now there were some wins for NVIDIA though in A Plague Tale where NVIDIA come up 3 degrees cooler, but for the most part it's a bit of a mixed bag when looking at the 19 games that we're showing here. Regardless, both cards presented more than capable cooling performance and nothing exceeded 68 degrees, showing that things were still well under control. So what can we take away from this video? Well, I think it's clear to see that NVIDIA does offer good performance for the money in the grand scheme of things, but AMD is just better in every single way. I feel that if the 7900 GRE had stuck with its original pricing when it was an Asia-only card of $649, then my conclusion would be much different. But thanks to the aggressive pricing from AMD, this has helped propel a GPU like the GRE to a much better proposition based on the performance that we've seen here today. As I mentioned, NVIDIA do have a few technologies that I guess help create an argument for them, like CUDA acceleration, that all-important NVENC encoder for streaming, and a better form of upscaling. But at the performance differences that we saw between the two cards here today, I just don't think that that's enough. Also, as I noted, the 4070 Super may seem like the better buy, and if it's something you want to see compared against the GRE in a future video, let us know in the comments section, because while these were so wildly different in performance, the Super's only $50 more, so is it $50 more better in terms of performance? Hopefully you get where I'm going with that. You are getting, I guess, more for your money, but without delving kind of too far into it, it's still too early to tell. And that's something, I'll have to test and analyze the data to give a kind of more full-blown conclusion on. Today, however, I think we can all agree that AMD, through their pricing, performance, driver updates, and performance increases in games, have seen a very big argument for buying an RDNA 3 GPU, like the GRE, over NVIDIA. And while it's only one card, it definitely shows what the red team are capable of doing. But on the flip side, I do get that they don't want to, say, soil the brand and just price trash all of their cards. Also, with rumours that they could be ditching the high-end X900 series of cards on the next generation, we don't really know what the future holds, but maybe this further instills the thought process that they may firmly set their sights on the mid-range 1440p high refresh gaming kind of market, with maybe a potential successor to the 7800 XT, or I don't know, they'll call it something completely different. Sure, when it comes to degree, many people won't be overly keen on the naming structure or how close it is to the 7800 XT, but when you see the value that you're getting and the performance, not only in rasterization, but in ray tracing too, I think they're just small oversights that anyone could easily look past. I guess, yeah, I'm gonna upset the NVIDIA fanboys on this one, and the AMD ones who were constantly calling me an NVIDIA shill in the last couple of videos, maybe a little bit lost for words on this one. Because all in all, AMD is the better buy this time round. Either way, with these videos, I'm always going to upset someone along the way. And you know what? That's fine, because it is what it is. For now, that's going to do it for this one. As always, let us know what kind of other head-to-heads you want to see. Should we do the 4070 Super versus the 7900 GRE, or maybe something else? Also, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, you can help support us over on Patreon, where you get access to all of the charts for all of the games, along with tons of other really cool benefits, including exclusive behind the scenes content, bi-weekly game nights, a super special area on our Discord, and much, much more. The link is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys.